In this video, we're going to think about community economics and explore the idea of civic capitalism. When we think about community economics in a broad sense, we could see how there's quite a bit of variability from one place to the next, and the amount of economic activity that's localized in a community is going to be related to how autonomous, resilient, and viable that community is. Some communities, they're dominated by regional, national, or global entities, multinational corporations, which have little responsibility or affiliation with the local community and could up and leave without any notice at any time. So communities dominated by such actors are really in a state of peril, a very kind of vulnerable state. On the other side of the coin are communities with a robust civic capitalism, which is an embedded local economy. And this has implications for how we buy things, produce things, and for how we work. In order to understand community economics, it's helpful to think about financial capital and the way that works in the current context, because economic growth and development requires investment. If you don't have capital, it's hard to develop an economy. And as noted by Tolbert et al. From 2014, there's been an ongoing consolidation of banks and financial institutions that has made access to investment funds scarce, particularly for small business owners who also tend to be local business owners. And so the decline of local financial institutions has coincided with the decline in local businesses. And this is one of the real barriers to promoting a civic capitalism. And absentee-owned financial institutions or national or international financial institutions are simply less likely to take a chance on small-scale businesses that have, low potential for success by their models. So we have this cycle going on of declining financial institutions, declining investment funds, and as a result, declining small businesses and firms that are local, because we need capital for those local producers, and the access is simply not there. And that's going to, of course, limit how much local enterprise can develop, and it also creates conditions that privilege larger firms that have less attachment to the local place, and that means we're promoting a system of instability and vulnerability instead of resiliency. So thinking about this idea of civic capitalism, we can look at the work of Mooney, who argues that we need to democratize the rural economy. And Mooney points to four tensions, and one of those is the tension between capitalism and democracy. Whereas democracy is built on everybody having a voice and participating, the way that capitalist organizations are operating typically is the owners, which are a small minority of the organization, typically make all the decisions. And there are some exceptions to that, as we'll see, such as the cooperative, not-for-profit organizations. And there's a tension between the local and global in terms of how embedded the economy is locally and in terms of resiliency and those types of issues. And then there's the tension between traditional versus new social movements, and the tension between production and consumption interest of the public. Whereas at one time rural communities were defined by their productive capacity, they're increasingly defined by their consumption. So when we think about the global capitalist economy, we can note that most organizations and firms are what we would call investment-oriented, and that means they have a shareholder model where they're publicly traded, and there's a board of directors who makes decisions, and most of those decisions are oriented to promoting profit growth in order to please the investors. Shareholders are the voters of how things work. They approve or disapprove of the decisions made by the board of directors. And this is not that democratic because it's a very small number of people making decisions that will impact a much wider range of people. And it gives huge benefit of power to large shareholders. So decision making is calculated by profit, and that means not necessarily by social or environmental concerns. And another way of saying that is that it's based on exchange values rather than use values. Most IOFs are globally organized, and that means they're not rooted in place. They're therefore more likely to relocate if the market demands it than a local firm, which would find it much more difficult to pick up and move. So we say local firms owned and operated by local people are much more rooted in the community. And economic ties that people have to one another in local communities tend to also spill over into social, cultural, and human ties. So you might work with somebody, but you might also have your kids in school together and participate in the PTA or some youth group or athletic club. There's a lot of different ways that people can interact outside of economic ties, although that may be one of the central ways people know each other. One promising alternative to the IOF is what's called the cooperative. And there's different types of cooperatives, but then we'll look at some of those. But what a cooperative offers is a viable model on which to build small town businesses. Local economic growth around cooperative models has actually some pretty good evidence of working in some places. It's not always successful, but it can be a good alternative. It involves a group of owner/employees running a business. And, if you are an employee who is also an owner of the business, then the success of that business is going to hinge on your performance as a worker. And so you'll be incentivized to work very hard to make sure that the business is successful. And, compare that to your, say, minimum wage worker in an IOF who really could care less about the success of the business as long as they're getting their small paycheck. In cooperatives, decision-making is much more democratic. There's usually a one vote, one worker rule in place. Not always, but that's usually the case. And that's certainly not the case with an IOF. And there's no division of worker and owner, so there's that conflict that plagues most organizations in a capitalist economy is just not there. So you have greater fairness and greater efficiency happening at the same time. Cooperatives tend to be locally rooted and embedded, connected to the locality, and moving operations is a difficult task. Some cooperatives allow members to join as users rather than as workers. You can buy a share as a person who consumes the product. Maybe it's a grocery store or something like that. By becoming a member, you get access to a certain amount of groceries as sort of like a dividend. And so membership grants user rights rather than return on investment, as is the case with IOF. And this opens the door to valuing things beyond profit. So use values come to have a greater priority in this scenario than exchange values, perhaps. A good case study analysis was conducted by Gray and Stoffren in 2014 that examined the transformation of a firm that was once cooperatively owned but was transformed into an IOF and what that meant. And it's the Dakota Growers Pasta Company, and it started as cooperative and devoted to local farmers, and they were producing durum, which is used to make pasta. And the worker/owners all voted to sell to Glencore International, which is a global IOF. And in return, Glencore promised to protect local actors and farmers, and eventually, as profit demanded it, reneged on that promise. And so the rug was sort of pulled out from underneath the local people who voted to allow themselves to be bought by Glencore. And eventually Glencore was bought by somebody else, not swallowed up by another firm. And so it tends to happen in a global economy, with larger and larger organizations swallowing up smaller ones. So the lessons of this case study that even well-intentioned investment-oriented firms such as Glencore International, because arguably they didn't really intend to renege on their promise in the beginning. I mean, I think their intentions were good, but shareholders made demands, right? Shareholders voted on going for profit over keeping a promise to local farmers. And that's sort of the lesson that comes out of this. Global firms don't think twice about relocating operations. All the ties are purely economic. There's no social responsibility to the economy or no environmental responsibility. And democratic decisions are not really part of the equation. So let's go back to this notion of civic capitalism as sort of an alternative to the global model we have of capitalism currently. And the global model is dominated by large-scale multinational corporations, whereas the civic capitalism model is dominated by locally embedded and rooted small-scale operations. And Tolbert et al. Say it may seem that the institutional basis for civic community in small-town America is dissolving. And they would say that's because of corporate capitalism, that these two models of capitalism are in conflict with one another, and what's winning currently is this global model. And we could see that when a Walmart pops up and a local main street closes down, so to speak. And that's one of the key things that they are critical of in their research, Tolbert. So if we look at the anatomy of corporate capitalism, which is global, we have global corporations that are multi-establishment firms with branch plants, and they are scattered around the world in the most strategic locations. And locations are chosen based on different advantages, such as cheap working conditions, right? Labor is cheap, and the regulations are low. So if there's a bunch of environmental regulations, for instance, corporations will avoid those spots, and they want to operate on a principle of maximizing profit, not in terms of being regulated. So corporate capitalism is very mobile. As soon as the regulations go up or the work gets too expensive, they are likely to pick up and move. There's a great deal of social distance under corporate capitalism between the managers and the workers and between the consumers and the workers, on the other hand, right? So corporate orientation, managers and owners tend to be loyal to the corporation, and there's really no thought about where it's operating. So there's no loyalty to a particular place. And that's why residential movement is so easy, and people often don't even think twice about relocating when their job demands it, right? Because it's just kind of the way things work under these rules of global corporate capitalism. So the upshot is global corporate capitalism does not promote local capacity. It does not strengthen communities. It's both everywhere and nowhere at the same time because it can move around. It's like a shiftless form. And national governments do not provide any kind of shelter from these corporations because if they do interfere too greatly, they risk losing the economic benefits that come from those corporations. So the beneficiaries are the owners, the shareholders, high-level managers in particular, and some of the workers. You know, people have jobs and so forth. There's certainly something to be said for employment. And any place that happens to play host to these corporations can enjoy some kind of benefits, even if on only a temporary basis. But there's some call among scholars to look at alternatives. Some are critical of capitalism itself, although I think that view is finding less and less support. It certainly remains one key strand of scholarship and thought. But others have turned their attention not so much to the entire system of capitalism, but more to the way it's organized in terms of global corporations rather than locally embedded organizations. And actually, this is not something that's new to social scientists. Research going back to the 40s by Mills and Ulmer, for example, found that small business towns tended to fare much better than towns that relied on a big business of some kind, right? Those that had large businesses tended to have a weak, independent middle class, corporate instead of community loyalty, and people judged one another based on their ties to the corporation, right? So status was rooted in your position in the corporation. And when big businesses dominate a community, there tends to be a weak sense of civic spirit, right? So people are less likely to be involved in their local communities. Small business people tend to establish and maintain a network of contacts and supporters because that's essential to the success of business. And that almost requires that you move beyond economic bases for relationships into other more social bases. And research by Goldschmidt found similar findings looking primarily at agriculture instead of businesses. There have been several follow-up studies, particularly of Goldschmidt's analysis by rural sociologists, and the support overwhelmingly, at least the preponderance of evidence tend to support it. And that's based on a meta-analysis that was conducted by Labeo and Stoffren. And also several studies support the findings of Mills and Ulmer. And here's the actual results of the meta-analysis by Labeo and Stoffren. And what they see is, they're looking at summary of studies examining the effects of industrialized farming on community well-being. And we can just generalize that to large-scale industry on community well-being. Whether it's farming or not is almost irrelevant. But what we see is the majority, 57% of the studies, find that industrialized farming is negative for community well-being, and only 18% found that it wasn't negative. It doesn't necessarily mean it was good for it, but sort of some counter findings, and then 25% found some kind of a mixed bag. But certainly, looking at all this evidence, the overwhelming response is that big business is not necessarily the answer to community well-being and quality of life. So local matters, because in local businesses, owners and managers are not just economic actors, but they're also socially and financially invested in the community. Arguably, they care about local environmental conditions more because they have to live there. So if the water is polluted, they're the ones who are going to be drinking it. Small firms also tend to have less bureaucratic structures and less degree of specialization. So workers tend to find the work less alienating, as do the managers. And the owners and managers themselves wind up being participating citizens of the community and viewed as a business segment, a business class in the community. They tend to hold a high level of status, and they develop strong ties. We'll see in the community quality of life research that status is highly related to satisfaction and attachment to communities. And with that level of satisfaction and attachment getting higher, there's even less likely that they want to move and relocate. Even during an economic downturn, they're probably more likely to kind of fight it out and struggle for extended periods of time. And they're more likely to support and lead local nonprofit institutions as part of their side job, their community involvement. Self-employment is also a mechanism for maintaining and strengthening ties to place, which forms a stronger local orientation. But maybe the key reason for thinking that civic capitalism may be a preferable model is social networks. Any successful small business is successful because of the network of customers that you develop. And if you were to pick up and move, you'd have to recreate a new network and essentially start from scratch. And that is very difficult. So there's a lot of disincentive for local businesses to pick up and move because the networks themselves are not portable, right? They're rooted in the local community, and as such, they strengthen local values and identity. So the question then becomes, what about research? What do we find in terms of support for civic capitalism? And it really hasn't amassed the kind of attention that it deserves. As we noted before, since the 70s, many social scientists just quit doing research on local communities, and civic capitalism research falls within that purview. But there are some studies, particularly the work of Tolbert and colleagues, and also Lyson, who has passed away, but there are some other students that they've worked with. Blanchard and Matthews have done research in this area. And so there's a few spots where civic capitalism is being researched. And not all research actually supports all of the central ideas. Young and Lyson find a challenge to the civic capitalism idea. They say that civic welfare is a function of economic and social characteristics, that the civic capitalism model is a little too economic in structure and ignores kind of the social end of things. And we need to focus also on the social dimensions of community, such as pluralism and solidarity and linkages and fluidity, what we would attach to the Cornell School of Thought. The key variables of local firms, though, are the size and social distance, which are much less than with corporate capitalism, and the scope. There's really not much desire to grow beyond the locality. Sometimes you'll see local chains where essentially a business that's successful can reproduce itself within the same geographic space and still do well if it's a large enough community, but it's very difficult to take a local business and completely replicate it successfully in another location. But well, I suppose that happens sometimes, but there's really no evidence that that is a successful strategy. So local firms tend to be less mobile, more rooted, and that means they're going to be around a lot longer typically, and the ownership of these firms become local elites that are socially and economically invested in the community, and so they can use their resources to enhance the community. And in fact, a lot of small towns rely on the philanthropy of local elites to promote such things as theaters, the arts, other local initiatives that require some kind of investment. So here's a basic model offered by Tolbert, trying to understand and predict civic welfare, which we can also tie to community quality of life, something we discuss in other places. But higher income levels, having less poverty, retaining residents, which has to do with community attachment, and having lower unemployment are the function of local capitalism, proliferation of self-employment, small, stable local businesses, family farms, but also having a robust civic life in terms of institutions, proliferation of churches, third places, organizations, and associations. So in summary, civic capitalism offers a model of capitalism that's an alternative to the global corporate model. It's a more localized version, and it offers a lot more potential for increasing the well-being of communities. Individuals, because of their overlapping economic and social ties, have a greater sense of responsibility to one another, creating more interconnections and interdependencies, and diminishing the purely economic decisions that tend to undermine communities, and we see all the time with global corporations. But as we think about successful civic capitalist communities, we can note that probably it's easier to pull off in smaller, more rural communities where the scale of life is more conducive to this model. The local scope of business in rural communities tends to promote civic capitalism and allows this kind of intertwining of social and economic ties. In cities, people tend to live much more compartmentalized lives, and it's hard to say if civic capitalism would work as well in an urban setting. But promoting civic capitalism is going to require empowering local entrepreneurs, which means finding sources of local capital, perhaps shoring up local financial institutions, and keeping global investment-oriented firms at bay, promoting non-economic civic organizations to enhance the community life and civic life. And if you have a robust local business elite around, that's more likely to happen. And finally, erasing the tensions that plague capitalism, such as that between the worker and owner, and that between the worker and consumer, and more broadly between the worker and community member, right? And with embedded local businesses, many of these are erased. These are some of the references of the research that were discussed in this video. If you wish to look into them further, I realize the text is kind of small, and I apologize for that. But thanks for watching, and take care.